What was supposed to be the safest cave in Florida, a beginner-friendly passage that had welcomed thousands of young explorers, became a death trap in less than 3 hours, transforming 8 confident teenagers into desperate survivors and 2 best friends into victims of their own ambition. In the suffocating blackness of Boy Scout Cave, 2 teenage boys lay trapped in a limestone tomb, their bodies slowly surrendering to the cold embrace of hypothermia while rescue teams raced against time through passages so narrow that grown men had to contort their bodies like circus performers just to reach them. What had begun as an innocent adventure for 8 boys from San Antonio Boy Village would become a harrowing tale of survival that would test the limits of human endurance and reveal the thin line between confidence and catastrophe. The story began on a sweltering Florida afternoon in 2003, when the relentless sun transformed the limestone landscape into a shimmering oven of heat and humidity. Michael Shiro, 15 years old and radiating the kind of restless energy that made teachers both admire and fear him, stood at the entrance to Boy Scout Cave with 7 other boys from the San Antonio Boy Village. The cave opening yawned before them like a hungry mouth, promising adventure and mystery in its depths. Beside Michael stood Javik Henderson, 16 and possessing the quiet intensity of someone who had already decided that ordinary experiences weren't enough. Henderson carried himself with the confidence of a young man who had tasted just enough danger to crave more, but not enough to understand its true cost. The other 6 boys clustered around them, their ages ranging from 13 to 16, each carrying their own mixture of excitement and apprehension about what lay ahead. The 2 counselors who had accompanied the group on this educational trip to Florida found themselves facing a dilemma that would haunt them for years to come. The cave entrance, while large enough for the boys, presented a significant challenge for adults of their size. The passages beyond were notorious for their tight confines, and the counselors understood that their presence could actually hinder rather than help the expedition. After much deliberation, they made the fateful decision to remain at the surface, setting up camp near the entrance where they could monitor the boys' return. Boy Scout Cave had earned its reputation through decades of use by scouting groups and amateur cavers. The limestone formation, carved over millions of years by the patient work of underground water systems, featured a complex network of passages that ranged from comfortably wide corridors to spaces so narrow that they challenged even the most flexible explorers. Despite its difficulty, the cave was considered relatively safe due to its stable structure and typically dry conditions. The rock formations were solid, the air circulation adequate, and the passages, while challenging, were well mapped by previous expeditions. The boys carried with them 9 flashlights, their combined beams creating a small constellation of light that seemed pitifully inadequate against the vast darkness that awaited them. Each flashlight represented not just illumination, but hope, safety, and the promise of finding their way back to the world above. None of them considered what would happen if those batteries began to fail. As the counselors settled in for their wait, one of them began gathering kindling for a small campfire. The Florida afternoon was brutal, but evening would bring cooler temperatures, and the flames would provide both warmth and a welcoming beacon for the boys' return. The fire crackled to life, sending smoke curling up into the humid air. None of them considered what would happen if those seemed like such a reasonable precaution, a simple comfort that would make the waiting more bearable. None of them could have predicted how this innocent decision would later amplify the terror of what was to come. At precisely 12:30 p.m., the 8 boys began their descent into the earth. The transformation was as sudden as it was complete. The oppressive Florida heat vanished within steps of the entrance, replaced by the cave's constant temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The change felt like stepping into an air-conditioned building after hours in the desert, and the boys couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as the cool air washed over their sweat-dampened skin. But relief quickly gave way to something else entirely. The darkness in Boy Scout Cave wasn't simply the absence of light, it was an active, living thing that seemed to press against them from all directions. Their flashlight beams, so bright and reassuring on the surface, became thin threads of illumination that revealed only fragments of their surroundings while leaving vast expanses of mystery in the shadows. The silence was equally profound. Gone were the sounds of wind through trees, the distant hum of traffic, the everyday audio backdrop of life above ground. In its place was something far more unsettling, a silence so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Every footstep, every whispered comment, every rustle of clothing echoed in ways that made the boys hyper-aware of their own presence in this alien environment. Michael naturally assumed the role of leader, his confidence and enthusiasm drawing the others forward into the cave's depths. Henderson stayed close behind him, the two older boys forming the vanguard of their small expedition. The passage they followed was wide enough to walk upright at first, its walls smooth limestone worn by countless years of water flow. Strange formations jutted from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and the floor was littered with rocks and debris that had fallen over the millennia. As they progressed deeper into the cave system, the passages began to change character. What had started as comfortable corridors gradually narrowed, forcing the boys to duck their heads and eventually to crawl on hands and knees. The rock walls pressed closer, and the ceiling dropped lower with each turn. The air remained cool and breathable, but something about the confined space began to affect the group's psychology. The flashlight beams danced across walls that seemed to close in with each step. Shadows shifted and moved in ways that played tricks on the eyes, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. The boys found themselves speaking in whispers without quite knowing why, as if the cave itself demanded reverence and quiet. After an hour of steady progress through increasingly challenging terrain, they reached a section of the cave that local cavers knew well and spoke of with particular respect. The hairpin curve was Boy Scout Cave's signature challenge, a passage that tested the limits of human flexibility and nerve. The formation was a natural bottleneck, where the cave's main corridor suddenly constricted into a horizontal slit barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. The passage was a masterpiece of geological engineering, carved by water into a shape that seemed almost deliberately designed to challenge human passage. The opening was perhaps 18 inches high and 2 feet wide, with rough limestone walls that scraped against anyone attempting to navigate its confines. But the real challenge lay beyond the initial constriction. The passage curved sharply, almost doubling back on itself in a tight S-shape that created a blind corner where explorers couldn't see what lay ahead. Michael approached the hairpin curve with the same confidence that had carried him through life's other challenges. He was lean and athletic, with the kind of wiry build that seemed designed for squeezing through tight spaces. The passage looked difficult but not impossible, and his experience with similar challenges in other caves had given him a perhaps false sense of security about his abilities. Henderson watched as his friend began to navigate the constriction, admiring the way Michael seemed to flow through spaces that would challenge most adults. The two had formed a strong friendship during their time at the boy village, bonded by their shared appetite for adventure and their mutual disdain for the safe, supervised activities that satisfied their peers. Michael disappeared around the curve, his flashlight beam creating an eerie glow that filtered back through the narrow opening. His voice echoed strangely in the confined space as he called back that the passage continued and seemed navigable. Henderson waited for the all-clear signal before beginning his own attempt at the crossing. What happened next would be replayed in Henderson's mind for years to come, each detail burned into his memory with the clarity that only comes from moments of absolute terror. He entered the hairpin curve with confidence, his body twisting and contorting to match the passage's unforgiving geometry. The limestone walls scraped against his back and chest as he wriggled forward, following the path that Michael had just completed successfully. But Henderson's body was slightly larger than his friend's, his shoulders just a fraction wider, his frame carrying just enough additional bulk to make the critical difference. As he reached the sharpest part of the curve, where the passage turned back on itself most severely, he found himself caught between the immovable walls of stone. The realization came gradually, like a nightmare slowly taking shape. At first, Henderson thought he simply needed to adjust his position, to find the right angle that would allow him to continue forward. He twisted left, then right, trying to align his body with the passage's demands. But each movement seemed to wedge him more firmly in place, the rough limestone gripping his clothing and skin with an almost malevolent determination. Panic began as a flutter in his chest, a small voice whispering that something was wrong. As seconds turned to minutes and his struggles became more frantic, that whisper grew to a roar. He was stuck, completely, utterly, helplessly stuck in a position that allowed him neither to move forward nor to retreat. The cave walls that had seemed merely challenging moments before now felt like the bars of a prison, trapping him in a limestone cage of his own making. Henderson's breathing quickened as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. He was wedged in the narrowest part of the passage, his body twisted into an unnatural position that sent jolts of pain through his ribs and hips with every attempt to move. The rough stone dug into his flesh, and he could feel his clothing tearing as he struggled against the unyielding rock. Michael, having successfully navigated the passage and moved a few feet beyond the curve, initially didn't realize what was happening. Henderson's struggles produced only muffled sounds that were difficult to interpret in the acoustic confusion of the narrow space. But as the sounds became more desperate and the silence between them stretched longer, Michael began to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. The decision to turn back and help his friend was made without hesitation, but implementing it proved to be a challenge that tested Michael's own limits. The space beyond the hairpin curve was only marginally wider than the passage itself, leaving little room for maneuvering. Michael had to reverse his own progress through the constriction, a process that required him to twist his body in ways that seemed to defy anatomy. When Michael finally reached Henderson's position, the sight that greeted him was one that would haunt his dreams for years to come. His friend was wedged tightly in the narrowest part of the passage, his body contorted at an angle that looked painful even to observe. Henderson's face was pale with exertion and fear, his breathing rapid and shallow as he fought against the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm him completely. The space available for a rescue attempt was almost impossibly small. Michael found himself pressed against Henderson's body, both boys crammed into a section of cave that seemed designed to hold one person uncomfortably rather than two in any configuration. The limestone walls pressed against them from all sides, making every movement a carefully calculated struggle against the unyielding stone. Michael's attempts to free his friend were hampered by the very factor that had caused the problem in the first place: there simply wasn't enough room to maneuver effectively. He tried pulling Henderson backward, pushing him forward, and attempting to help him twist into different positions that might allow escape. But each effort seemed to make the situation worse, wedging Henderson more firmly into the passage's grip. The physical exertion of the rescue attempt began to take its toll on both boys. The cave's 72-degree temperature, so refreshing when they had first entered, now felt cold against their sweat-dampened skin. The constant contact with the limestone walls was drawing heat from their bodies at an alarming rate, and their lack of movement was preventing their metabolisms from generating the warmth they needed to maintain their core temperatures. Henderson's situation was particularly dire. Wedged in his unnatural position, he couldn't move enough to generate body heat, and his awkward posture was restricting his circulation and breathing. Sharp edges of rock dug into his ribs and hips, sending constant waves of pain through his body that made concentration difficult and added to his growing sense of desperation. The psychological pressure was as damaging as the physical challenges. Henderson could feel the walls of the cave pressing in around him, could sense the vast weight of rock above him, could imagine the tons of limestone that separated him from the surface world. The darkness beyond their flashlight beams seemed alive with malevolent intent, and the silence between his struggles felt pregnant with doom. Michael continued his rescue attempts with the determination of someone who refused to accept defeat, but the confined space and his own growing exhaustion were making his efforts less effective with each passing minute. His vision began to blur from the combination of physical exertion, stress, and the early stages of hypothermia. His muscles, already strained from the difficult passage and the rescue attempts, began to feel weak and unresponsive. The crisis reached its peak with shocking suddenness. Michael, in the middle of another attempt to free Henderson, suddenly collapsed against the narrow walls of the passage. His body, pushed beyond its limits by the combination of physical stress, cold, and adrenaline, simply shut down. One moment he was conscious and fighting to save his friend, the next, he was slumped unconscious in the narrow confines of the hairpin curve. Henderson's panic, already at dangerous levels, exploded into full-blown terror as he realized that his rescuer had become another victim. Now not only was he trapped and unable to move, but his best hope for escape lay unconscious beside him in the narrow passage. His shouts for help echoed through the limestone corridors, carrying his desperation to the other boys who waited in the wider sections of the cave. The 6 remaining boys, huddled together in a section of the cave large enough for them to stand and move freely, heard Henderson's cries with growing alarm. Their flashlights, dancing nervously across the cave walls, revealed faces pale with fear and uncertainty. The bravado that had carried them into the cave's depths had evaporated, replaced by the stark realization that they were facing a situation far beyond their abilities to handle. The boys' initial response was to organize their own rescue attempt, but the narrow passage that led to the hairpin curve could accommodate only one person at a time, and none of them possessed the experience or equipment necessary to free their trapped friends. Their flashlight beams revealed the terrible truth, that Michael and Henderson were beyond their help, trapped in a section of cave that had defeated even their strongest and most experienced members. As the minutes stretched into an hour, a new fear began to grip the waiting boys. The campfire that their counselors had built at the cave entrance, so innocent in its original purpose, now became the source of a terrifying possibility. What if the fire was consuming the cave's oxygen? What if the smoke was infiltrating the passages, slowly poisoning the air they breathed? The idea, once planted, grew with the relentless logic of panic. The boys could imagine the oxygen levels dropping steadily, could envision themselves suffocating in the depths of the cave while help remained impossibly far away. Their breathing became labored, though whether from actual oxygen depletion or psychological suggestion was impossible to determine in their state of fear. The decision to abandon Michael and Henderson was perhaps the most difficult choice any of them had ever faced. Every instinct screamed against leaving their friends behind, against retreating to safety while 2 of their companions remained trapped in the limestone maze. But the growing fear of suffocation, combined with their inability to effect a rescue, made the choice seem inevitable. The journey back to the cave entrance became a desperate race against time and rising panic. The boys crawled and scrambled through passages that had seemed manageable on the way in but now felt like obstacle courses designed to slow their escape. Their flashlights, beginning to dim as batteries weakened, cast increasingly feeble beams that barely penetrated the surrounding darkness. When they finally emerged into the Florida sunlight, their appearance was so alarming that the counselors immediately understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The boys were pale, shaking, and barely coherent as they tried to explain what had happened in the cave's depths. Their words tumbled over each other in a rush of panic and guilt, painting a picture of disaster that left the adults stunned and terrified. The counselor's first action was to extinguish the campfire that had seemed so harmless just hours before. The flames died with a hiss, but the damage to everyone's peace of mind had already been done. One counselor immediately called 911 while the other tried to comfort the traumatized boys, though his own hands shook as he contemplated the magnitude of the situation they were facing. The rescue operation that followed was a masterpiece of coordination and expertise, though it unfolded with agonizing slowness for everyone involved. The first responders who arrived at the scene were experienced cave rescue specialists, men and women who had dedicated their lives to extracting people from the underground places where they sometimes became trapped. But even these experts understood that the challenges ahead would test their skills and equipment to the limit. Boy Scout Cave's reputation among rescue workers was well established. The tight passages that made it an exciting challenge for recreational cavers also made it one of the most difficult caves in the region for rescue operations. The narrow confines meant that rescuers couldn't bring large amounts of equipment into the cave, and the twisting passages made communication between surface and underground teams nearly impossible. The report of potential oxygen depletion added urgency to an already critical situation. The rescue teams prepared for the possibility that they might find victims of carbon monoxide poisoning or suffocation, and they brought equipment designed to monitor and improve air quality in confined spaces. Time was now measured not in hours but in minutes, and every delay could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. Inside the cave, the situation was both better and worse than anyone had imagined. The remaining boys, huddled together in the wider passages, were physically unharmed but psychologically devastated by what they had witnessed and the choices they had been forced to make. The rescue teams found them clustered together like survivors of a shipwreck, their faces streaked with tears and their eyes reflecting the trauma of their underground ordeal. The rescuers' first priority was to assess the air quality in the cave, a process that revealed both good news and bad news. The oxygen levels were normal. The fears of suffocation had been largely psychological, triggered by panic and the power of suggestion. The campfire had not depleted the cave's air supply, and the boys had never been in danger of asphyxiation. But while this removed one threat, it didn't change the fact that two teenagers remained trapped in the cave's most challenging passage, their condition unknown and their rescue requiring specialized techniques and equipment. The route to the hairpin curve led the rescue teams through increasingly difficult terrain, passages that challenged even their considerable experience with underground rescue operations. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, but the narrow confines forced them to travel in single file and limited the amount of equipment they could transport to the scene of the entrapment. When the rescuers finally reached Michael and Henderson, the sight that greeted them was both heartening and terrifying. Henderson was still conscious, though his condition had deteriorated significantly during the hours he had spent wedged in the limestone passage. His skin was pale and clammy, his speech slurred by the early stages of hypothermia, and his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. But he was alive and aware, and his eyes lit up with desperate hope when he saw the rescue team's lights approaching through the narrow passage. Michael's condition was far more serious. He remained unconscious, his body temperature dangerously low and his breathing shallow and irregular. The combination of physical exhaustion, psychological stress, and prolonged exposure to the cave's cold had pushed him to the very edge of survival. His pulse was weak but detectable, and the rescue team's medical assessment revealed that he was in critical condition but still alive. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to human ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to take extraordinary risks to save lives. The rescuers worked in shifts in the narrow confines of the passage, using hand tools to carefully widen the opening that held Henderson trapped. Each strike of chisel against limestone had to be calculated and precise. Too little force would make no progress, while too much could cause a rockfall that would make the situation infinitely worse. The work was exhausting and dangerous. The rescuers had to contort their bodies into positions similar to those that had trapped the boys, working in spaces so confined that they could barely move their arms. The limestone dust from their chiseling work filled the narrow passage, making breathing difficult and reducing visibility even further. And always present was the knowledge that time was running out, that hypothermia was claiming both boys with each passing minute. After more than an hour of painstaking work, the passage was finally wide enough to allow Henderson's extraction. The moment when he was pulled free from the hairpin curve was both triumphant and heartbreaking. Triumphant because he was alive and would survive his ordeal, heartbreaking because his body remained stiff and trembling from the hours of exposure and trauma. The rescue team quickly wrapped him in thermal blankets and began the arduous process of moving him through the narrow passages toward the surface. With Henderson safely extracted, the rescue team's attention turned to Michael, whose condition had continued to deteriorate during the hours of rescue work. His unconscious state was now complete, his body showing all the signs of severe hypothermia. The rescuers worked with renewed urgency, knowing that every minute of delay reduced their chances of bringing him out alive. The extraction of an unconscious victim from such a confined space presented challenges that tested every aspect of the rescue team's training and experience. Michael's limp body had to be carefully maneuvered through passages that had challenged him even when he was conscious and able to help with his own movement. The rescuers worked as a relay team, passing his body from one team member to another as they navigated the cave's twisting corridors. The journey to the surface took nearly 2 hours during which Michael's life hung in the balance and his rescuers fought against exhaustion, confined spaces, and the relentless pressure of time. When they finally emerged into the Florida sunlight, the scene was one of controlled chaos as emergency medical teams took over the fight to save Michael's life. Both boys were rushed to the hospital, where they faced a different kind of battle, the fight against hypothermia and its potentially devastating effects on their bodies and minds. Henderson, conscious but severely hypothermic, responded well to warming treatments and gradually returned to normal body temperature. His physical injuries were relatively minor, scrapes and bruises from his struggle in the cave, but the psychological impact of his ordeal would take much longer to heal. Michael's condition was far more serious. He remained unconscious for an entire day while medical teams worked to slowly and carefully raise his body temperature and restore normal function to his organs. The hours he had spent in the cave's grip had pushed his body to the very limits of survival, and his recovery would be measured not in hours but in days and weeks. The aftermath of the Boy Scout cave incident would reverberate through the caving community for years to come. The rescue operation, while ultimately successful, had highlighted the inherent dangers of cave exploration and the critical importance of proper preparation, equipment, and supervision. The decision by the counselors to remain on the surface, while well-intentioned, had left the boys without the adult guidance that might have prevented the tragedy. The incident also revealed the complex psychology of panic and fear in confined spaces. The boys' conviction that they were being poisoned by smoke from the surface fire had been entirely psychological, but no less real for being imaginary. The power of suggestion in high-stress situations had transformed a minor concern into a major psychological crisis that had influenced every decision they made during their underground ordeal. For Michael and Henderson, the cave rescue would mark the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. Both boys would eventually make full physical recoveries from their ordeal, but the psychological impact would linger far longer than their physical injuries. The experience would change their relationship with risk and adventure, tempering their youthful sense of invincibility with a hard-earned understanding of mortality and consequence. The rescue teams who had worked so tirelessly to save them would carry their own memories of the operation, adding another chapter to the ongoing story of human courage and determination in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Their success in extracting both boys alive from one of the most difficult rescue scenarios imaginable would stand as a testament to the power of training, teamwork, and the refusal to give up hope even in the darkest circumstances. The Boy Scout cave itself would continue to challenge and test future generations of explorers, its passages remaining as narrow and unforgiving as ever. But the story of Michael and Henderson's rescue would become part of its legend, a reminder that the underground world demands respect, preparation, and humility from all who dare to enter its dark domain. The cave had claimed 2 victims, if only temporarily, but it had also revealed the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go to save one another, even in the most challenging and dangerous circumstances imaginable.